We're going to keep at this, and we will, our goal is not comfortable conversations, it's the uncomfortable ones that are cool. So, and I think we're going to have some great conversation today. We're going to dive right in right now. Our first guest is Taylor Lorenz. You all know her as a columnist at the Washington Post covering technology and online culture. Prior to joining the Post, Taylor was a technology reporter at the New York Times, The Atlantic, and the Daily Beast. And joining her on stage is Ben Smith, co-founder and our founding editor-in-chief of Semafor. Ben? Good morning, Taylor.
Yeah, when he said uncomfortable conversations, he didn't mean that the mic should be on the wrong side. Thank you all for coming. We're really excited about this, and you've probably heard enough intro. Yeah, I don't know if you heard the intro, but it was about uncomfortable conversations, so be warned. Actually, Taylor and I were colleagues at the New York Times, which was like uncomfortable conversations central, and because I was the media reporter, I was widely viewed as a spy and got thrown out of all the internal Slacks. And Taylor started a special kind of quarantine Slack where people could talk to me, for which I'm grateful.
That was a great Slack.
And I think I want to start with something I think we basically agree on, but I think makes a lot of journalists uncomfortable, which is this idea that individual reporters are brands. Sometimes the words like creators, influencers get used, and I think a lot of journalists feel nauseous when they hear those words. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think there's a stigma around certain brands or certain words like influencer and brand because they're so tightly tied with consumerism and commodifying yourself, and we're not maybe supposed to do that ourselves. We're supposed to be above that as journalists, I think, traditionally. It's such a funny conversation because journalists have always had brands. If you consider the word brand basically a synonym for reputation, we've had hugely famous journalists in the past. I think the difference now is that those journalists control the brands, right? They have more autonomy over their own brands and building their own brands versus the institutions. You get on CBS News.
Yeah, do you think, I think you've been sort of the journalist most associated with making the case to the rest of us in some ways, that you should just suck it up, you're an influencer like everybody else. Do you feel like you're winning people over?
Well, I don't need to win any people over because this is just the nature of the media landscape, and it's sort of the crux of what I cover. I cover technology, but it's really about how technology is disrupting media through sort of the influencer world and everything getting more distributed.
So I think the notion that in every field, in sports, in politics, sort of for better and for worse, that power and attention are going from institutions to individuals is kind of the world we live in right now. But at Semafor, we're certainly thinking about that and thinking about hiring great journalists, and to some degree saying, we're going to yoke our brand to yours because we're a new brand and we'd like to build around these great journalists. You work for the Washington Post, which is a rather well-known brand, and isn't necessarily no one's ever heard of the Washington Post. We gotta hitch our wagon to Taylor Lorenz's star, and so. But I'm curious, how do you think about, and particularly when it comes to trust? I think in some sense when you say reputation, you're saying, trust me as a journalist, trust my voice. The Washington Post is a kind of a classic institution that's saying, you know what, ignore who's writing it, ignore all the atmospherics, trust the Washington Post. How do you think about the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, I would push back on that in the sense that I don't think that's been my experience at the Post. I think that, Woodward and Bernstein, right, two famous Post reporters. There's plenty of, Philip Brump, my colleague, I think has a very strong brand, Margaret Sullivan. I think the Post has actually been very good about sort of incubating talent. Of course, I'm honored to work for such a big brand, as you say. But in terms of establishing trust, we just see that people establish trust with individuals, and so you need to be accountable sort of in that way. It's obviously a dance, and I think it's also, I tend to focus on my authority to my beat, right? No one would trust me going off and covering, I don't even know, cars or auto, and I don't try and...
You live in LA.
True. But, I sort of hitch my authority to my beat and really establish trust there and don't try and compete with the Washington Post to be the authority on everything.
But do you feel a tension between asking people to trust you and sort of steering people toward, just trust the Washington Post? We have a set of standards, we have editors, it's not, ultimately it's not me. I mean, that's really the promise of the Post.
Definitely.
Do you feel a tension there? I'm not saying from a perspective of management or how the Post operates, but more from the audience perspective.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we see these tensions play out a lot of the time in sort of different creator economy landscapes as well. I guess like that tension doesn't manifest so much because it kind of depends story by story. Like my stories, people are trusting me for my stories. Like if they're going to trust the post-election coverage counter or whatever, it's not really my job to establish that trust. I'm more like shoring up trust on a specific beat. Oh, we know that the Post is going to be good on covering influencers because they have Taylor Lorenz.
Do you worry that if you make mistakes, you're burning the Washington Post's goodwill, the Washington Post's trust? In some ways you have to be more conservative and more cautious at an institution like the Post?
I think it's a complete two-way street on that, right? Not only do I have to be cautious of the Post's broader sort of brand, as you would say, or credibility, but the Post also, and any mainstream media institution, has to protect their reporters. And that's been something that I think we've seen a lot of traditional media struggle to do. The Post has been great, but we're sort of in this world now where we operate in concert with each other. So.
Yeah, I actually do want to ask you about that in a second. But I think on the sort of biggest picture question about this, I think, because I think I sort of embrace it as a reality that people connect to individuals, to journalists, rather probably than primarily to a brand. But aren't we fundamentally in this to tell other people's stories, not our own? Isn't there some kind of deep tension there?
It's so funny with that. I don't put myself in my stories at all. I think my stories resonate because of the content that I'm covering, but people don't know anything about me personally, and my life is not really, like, I'm not, necessarily doing that. That's not to say, there's amazing reporters, for instance, Kashmir Hill at the New York Times, right? Like, she's in a lot of her stories, but she uses that personal experience with technology to tell amazing, compelling tales. So I just feel like that's like a fluid thing, in terms of like.
And do you think you can draw a sharp line between the extent to which you do you're probably the most like extremely online reporter in America, or one of them, between the way you essentially tell your own story on social media and don't in a news article? I mean, do you think, because it seems to me a lot of readers probably see both. Do you think there's a sort of hard line between those?
Well, I think look at sort of how content creators operate, right? Like there's your content, there's what you produce, and then there's you maybe as an authority or a personality. Just the way in traditional media, the way this would have played out is like maybe you read, right, Ben, I read one of your articles on Politico, and then I see you giving commentary on CNN. It's you, it's just two different sort of products. And I guess I think of my journalism as one product, I guess, that I offer readers.
Got it. Well, as a fellow content creator, and I think let me move to something in this space that I think we probably disagree a little bit on, which is you talked about the attacks that journalists face, the importance of institutions standing by them, and there are people. I mean, I think you certainly, a lot of women face really like atrocious harassment that often crosses offline, but also really heated disagreement. And something that I've seen you tweet, and I sort of searched your Twitter this morning. You wisely delete tweets, so it doesn't go back that far. But you'd use the phrase "bad faith."
Yes.
Like more than 15 or 16 times since you last deleted your tweets. And I guess how do you know who's in bad faith? Like, what's my faith? You're sort of looking into people's hearts and saying, this person who disagrees with me, they're not mad at me because I got something wrong. They're not mad at me because they think I'm too liberal. They're fundamentally in bad faith. And how do you say that?
You can tell the difference between someone who disagrees with you and someone who's not operating in good faith.
How?
Just based on the nature of their question, right? Like, for instance, if they're coming to you in an honest capacity and saying like, hey, like, I noticed XYZ, you're like, oh, okay, I'll take your feedback, right? Or like, I hear this all the time. On every story I write, I hear lots of different perspectives, especially trend stories that I do. But if somebody's coming at you and they're making personal attacks, they're misrepresenting you, they're kind of actively participating in networked harassment in the sense that you see them sort of retweeting other people that are just not there for constructive criticism. I think it's just, can you tell the difference between constructive criticism and not constructive criticism?
Well, you can make a guess, right? But I think a lot of these people might say, yeah, maybe I was really angry. Maybe I said something obnoxious, but it's not because I'm in bad faith.
Sure,
I
sure,
think,
sure.
I think Ben is a liberal hack. That's why I did that.
No, sure. And I think, just having those conversations, being open. I'm a huge blocker on Twitter. I just if someone's annoying me, I'm like, ugh, block. And sometimes people will email me, oh, I didn't mean it like that or whatever. And I'm like, oh my God, no worries. And sorry about the miscommunication. And, let's hear it out. I think it's also so much of these types of sort of tensions come out on social media. And so you have to kind of think about the incentive structure there and whether people are just there for the retweets and sort of to signal to their own crowd or whether they're emailing you in private. I mean, I get hundreds of emails a week and I try to respond to every single person that asks me a legitimate sort of question or has feedback on my stories. Like I said, especially trend stories. Those are the ones that people,
Trend stories?
Yeah, OK Boomer or something. People are like, oh, I think XYZ. Like people want to share their feedback, and I love that because that gives me more story ideas.
But to go back, I mean, I think the thing that bugs me about bad faith is that you are basically guessing what's in people's hearts, right, or in their heads.
How would you suggest knowing otherwise? Or I guess.
I think you have to. I mean, how can you know? How can you purport to know?
Well, I think it's quite obvious. I guess again, it's of course it's somewhat of a guess, but it's not a hard guess to make. I mean, of course, do people get it wrong? Sure, and maybe did somebody miscommunicate? Sure, but I mean, then.
But if somebody is I saw people. There was an error. I mean, I kind of don't want to revisit the details, but there was an error in a Washington Post story. The person who the error was about, whether the Post had called them or not, was furious and being, not behaving at their best, I would say. But is that bad faith?
So let's consider that person's history, right, and the role that they played in Gamergate and Comicsgate, and let's also.
Right, but you made an error about them. Of course they're mad.
Well, there was an error in the story.
Yeah, I'm sorry, not trying to revisit.
But of course, which is.
But why not just say? You're not in bad faith. I'm sorry we screwed up.
Absolutely.
And I see why you're mad.
And Ben, if you read my emails, you would see that's exactly what we did. Exactly. And because even Keemstar.
It wasn't what you guys did in public. In public, you did the thing that I do think it's also important newsrooms do, which is just defend. But I wonder if there's some.
I don't think so, Ben. There was a full 24 hours where I said, hey, how can I help you? Actually really responded. The only thing that I said about that was after, I had been doxxed and it was very clear that it was such bad faith. And look, did I anticipate that guy was not coming in good faith? Certainly. But I thought, oh my gosh, this was an obvious thing that I can correct right away. Let me reach out to him. And then when it became clear that he was doing these live streams and kind of, I don't want to relitigate it because I don't.
Isn't he just another content creator?
No, but I work with content creators for a living, and let me tell you, I deal with that kind of drama. I think people on Twitter are not used to it, because that's what was so interesting to me about that. Those things, 24/7, somebody's making a reaction video about my stories, but that one was on Twitter, and that's the thing, because media people are on Twitter only, as we know.
Right. No, I know, and there's the crossover of TikTok culture and Twitter culture is often a confusing thing.
I do keep my email open, and there's many people that I would say, even people that have harassed me in the past that have.
But I guess just I'll let this go in a second, but I guess the notion. I mean, you can say this guy's being horrible, that he's overreacting to this error.
It's not just overreacting.
That he's trying to get attention off it, that he's capitalizing on it in various ways, that he's trying to get clout. But how do you know if in his heart he's mad or not, if he's bad faith or good faith? That's the thing.
He said that he wants to go to war with the media and destroy the Washington Post. That's probably half the people in this room. Of course, but I think that's true. I guess it just goes back to judgment. We as journalists use judgment every single day and sort of how we interact with people. All I can do is respond to people in good faith, send that email, say, hey, look, please, I want to work with you, especially in the case if we have an error, I want to sort of correct that immediately. Now, if you come back with that, with this crazy kind of campaign, and that continues for days, I'm going to assume, you're not there. Now, that said, would I shut him down? If anyone wanted to reach out again, of course not. I'm going to hear people out. But trust me, I've dealt with YouTubers for over a decade, and this is not my first rodeo. So I don't know. I guess it goes back to judgment.
No, I understand that. do you think, I mean, I guess it's interesting because I guess I see when I see the term bad faith mostly gets applied to right-wingers on the internet. And it's interesting because I think you're seeing it sort of in this Twitter versus YouTube, TikTok spectrum. But do you think, the critics of mainstream media, your critics certainly are mostly to the right. Do you think bad faith is primarily a right-wing phenomenon or this kind of criticism? Like, do you feel like you have sometimes when you're, people who love your work are sharing it, that they're in bad faith?
I think bad faith can be, anyone can be in bad faith, right? Anyone can be kind of a troll or kind of do something in bad faith, sure. I think obviously a lot of more extreme figures on the right kind of play into that a lot, but I get criticism from all different types of people depending on the story, right? So I think ultimately you just have to have faith in your reporting. And I agree with you that bad faith's not the best term, but I haven't come up with a better one for it. So I guess I'm going to keep posting it 16 times.
Yeah, I guess what makes me nervous about it is the notion you're looking into somebody's head or their heart and guessing
Their
what
faith.
they think.
I don't know.
What's my good faith? Like most days, I don't know.
You know what? I always give everyone the benefit of the doubt.
I appreciate that. Yeah. I feel like there was a moment there where you were like, is he in bad faith? I don't know.
No,
no.
Just the fact that you're willing to have a conversation with me, Ben, shows me that you're not.
You saved me at the Times. Do you think that axis of like the blindness of those of us who live on Twitter to the largely, kind of maybe primarily youth culture, but American culture of these other platforms is a huge blind spot?
Yes, undeniably. I think, and look, I'm on Twitter all day. Okay, I'm not bashing journalists for being on Twitter. I think it's an incredibly useful tool, especially in media and politics. Sure.
You wish you were on it less?
Well, I was off it for like 5 months when I was on book leave. I like go off and on. But I think that that's where these narratives emerge, and I wish that people spent a little bit more time on YouTube and TikTok because I think that they would have a better understanding of these online dynamics.
You hear that? Spend more time on TikTok. I highly recommend also. And there was a great story, which we will not get deeply into now, about how the mainstream media totally missed where the roots of the recent Gru mania.
Yes.
That it was all TikTok. There's one other, I guess, Twitter-related question that I wanted to ask about, just because this is, you tweet things and people are going to ask you about them.
Yeah.
Which is that you, you and I probably have somewhat different perceptions of COVID risk in a way that makes no sense for us to debate for this audience, neither of us being experts. But you tweeted that you don't listen to the blue check doctors on Twitter. And you shared an article from a...
That wasn't the full tweet.
Sorry, who consistently downplay, and maybe someone can throw the tweet out.
A very important qualifying
Who consistently
statement.
downplay long
There's a
COVID
great
or the virus's devastating long-term effects, and you shared an article from a magazine in British Columbia that...
No, I shared Ed Yong. I actually shared 2 Ed Yong Atlantic articles in that thread and said Ed Yong, my former colleague at the Atlantic, is an example of a really great person. Then I also shared people like Eric Topol and other doctors.
Right, but you shared an article as well as those from this British Columbia magazine that Angie Rasmussen, who's a fairly cautious academic on this, described as poorly sourced, grossly misleading, hyperbolic bullshit. And I guess, we journalists...
Which, by the way, did you see my tweets about it as well? I totally agreed with Angie, and I actually shared all of that kind of like breakdown about that piece,
but
which I think was an
but let me sort of ask the question, which is, I think you have a somewhat different belief about how scary long COVID is from a lot of the establishment, not everybody.
Yeah.
And journalists just spent the last 2 years pushing social platforms to listen to blue check doctors and often to delete the accounts of people who don't.
Well,
and I guess I wonder,
yeah.
do you think there ought to be some mid-level executive at Twitter kind of looking at Angie's tweet, looking at your thread saying, should we suspend Taylor? Should we delete Taylor's account? I mean, basically, like, who ought to make that decision?
Well,
Who's a legitimate voice?
I don't know why me retweeting an article from another journalist would come on me. I didn't even have the most viral tweet. I mean, another fellow journalist.
But a lot of journalists spent a lot of time pointing to people who, to my view, had insane views about COVID early on, who were sharing sources that Angie described that way, and a lot of them got suspended. A lot of them got their accounts deleted. And there was a huge movement. There was a huge wave of coverage of, journalists, non-journalist people who were sharing, non-experts who were sharing, Alex Berenson type people who were sharing, I don't know if they,
Misinformation is what you're
well,
talking about, right? They were
things
sharing
that experts
anti-vax.
thought were misleading bullshit.
Yeah,
And
I know. I think
if
this-
you share that, should there be some Twitter executive making a call about you?
Well, I mean, I think it's a really big difference between sharing a link to a legitimate, very respected news organization.
It was a random magazine in
It's
British
not
Columbia. that-
maybe random to some people, but it's certainly, I think, among certain Canadian media, well known. And I retweet probably hundreds of articles a day. I thought
Yeah.
it was interesting, and I actually couched it and then said, this article sort of like doesn't, as we all do as journalists, like doesn't really meet the bar for certain things, but I do think it speaks to certain COVID things. I'm extremely high risk with COVID, right? I don't want to get so into my medical background, but I think a big conversation, especially around the return to work stuff, has been journalists such as myself, and there are many within these newsrooms, being left out of the conversation. For instance, being sort of shut out, and not just us, but also the stories that we tell, and whose stories do we tell? Ed Yong has done an amazing job, I think, of really walking that line. I'm certainly not a health reporter, but as somebody that has great expertise in chronic illness and dealing with a lot of these things personally, I certainly retweet articles.
Yeah, and I'm not looking to debate the substance with you or judge your sort of perceptions, or your views, or assert mine. But I guess I wondered, do you worry that we went too far, or that journalists went too far in saying, social media platforms ought to enforce a scientific consensus? That right now you don't totally agree.
I've certainly never said that.
So you think they should have left the Alex Berensons of the world on Twitter?
I mean, I think there was a huge takedown of Angie's thread, right? And so I think.
I mean, there's a debate, right?
Right,
I think,
exactly.
But I
That's
think
exactly
early
my
in
point.
COVID, and I thought this was wise.
Yeah.
Twitter employees went and deleted people's accounts who debated with people like with Angie.
I mean, I don't work for Twitter. I have no knowledge
Well,
of that.
you and I are actually experts in Twitter, if
Sure.
nothing
Well,
else.
I mean, look, I'll share links to a mainstream news article.
Yeah.
Sometimes I run things. A lot of my friends are health reporters. I talk to them all the time. Hey, what do you think? Actually, just a fellow health reporter who has expertise in certain things related to that article, and I said, oh, what do you think? And should I? What do you think on this? Because they're covering that stuff all day. So I think, look, I retweet 100 news articles a day, but I will say, Ben, it's interesting that when I retweet things, that's a news cycle. Whereas another blue check journalist does the same, tweeted the same thing.
The blessing and the curse of being a brand.
Exactly, exactly.
Well, thank you for thanks for putting up with me and my mixed faith. Thanks.
Thanks, Ben.